tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Nevertheless, want to pivot here ever so slightly to our discussion we had yesterday on Israel. And I will say time and time again, I am a supporter of Israel and of the Jewish people, and I have been heartbroken to see all of the displays that have masqueraded as normal political protest. People storming into a Jewish-owned restaurant in Toronto, people who are protesting outside literally a Jewish daycare in Toronto, not to mention the vile and very often anti-Semitic rhetoric we hear from these people. But oftentimes, things are not explicitly anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. They are cloaked in language that may sound entirely normal. One of these is a word that sounds on the surface to be wonderful, which is a ceasefire. People, I think, understandably associate a ceasefire with peace. Two belligerents in a war that agree for a time or perhaps permanently to lay down arms and perhaps work out some agreement in the meantime to end conflict. This is something that, again, on the surface sounds lovely, but in the context here is completely devoid of sense and understanding of history, and I would say is devoid of justice. Hamas struck a terrible blow against Israel more than 2 weeks ago. There are still more than 200 hostages who are being held captive by Hamas. You've had 1,500 innocent lives lost to this conflict. Israel has a right to defend itself, and Israel, which has been living under the perpetual threat by Hamas for years, has understandably the desire to obliterate Hamas, which is, under any interpretation of international law, its right. Why then do we see so many people, including liberal members of parliament, new Democratic members of parliament, many people from the left, calling for a quote-unquote ceasefire? I want to welcome to the show Joe Roberts, who is a progressive voice, a fantastic writer and podcaster. He is the chair of JSpace Canada and joins me now. Joe, it's good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Now, I'm not trying to wedge you on your colleagues on the left with whom you get along on, probably 95% of issues, but I know it's been a very challenging time in the last couple of weeks. And I was just wondering, first off, if you could just explain how that's been, because I know that other people I've spoken to of your political persuasion have said they've, learned that some of their friends were not actually their friends.
It's been sobering. I mean, I think, look, we saw violence and brutality on October 7th that's incomprehensible. You can't even put words around it to make it make any sense. And the response from some of our allies on the left has been shameful, I think is the best word for it. I mean, really, truly hurtful. People that we've made allyship with on racial justice, on social justice, on economic justice. We've stood by. We've been supportive of their efforts when they were threatened. We just didn't see the same. Now, I want to be really clear. It's not everybody. It's a fragment of the left, but it has been a really problematic thing. I mean, and the vitriol, the anger, the interlacing of anti-Semitism is problematic. All around, it's been a real challenge.
When we look at that word ceasefire, it's to me a bit of, we hear oftentimes from people dog whistle as the term, that something can be, offensive without intending to be. And I fear that ceasefire calls are like that, because when someone says we need a ceasefire, what they're in fact saying is that Israel has no right to defend itself and no justification to defend itself. And you had a great piece in the National Post about this. I was wondering if you could explain how you've approached this and these calls for a ceasefire. Apparently, he was not just staring intently. His camera has frozen. We'll get Joe Roberts back on the program in a moment. Let me, while we're doing that, play this clip. This was a call to Pierre Poilievre that was put to him by a CP24 reporter on Saturday about this.
Did you tell your MPs not to sign this, or symbolically, do you think it would have, obviously you can't force a terrorist organization, an organization that's been declared a terrorist organization for decades now in this country, to abide by it, but symbolically, do you think it would have made a difference?
What?
To sign this letter, at least to say, the Americans have encouraged, and they've had discussions with Netanyahu to, undertake the most peaceful approach possible in this situation, while also saying Israel has the right to defend itself, which the Prime Minister here has said on several occasions since this all unfolded, this horrific event 2 weeks ago.
So what is your question?
Symbolically, would it have maybe being a gesture to have Conservative MPs join Liberals and New Democrats and Greens in saying, let's call for a ceasefire?
It would have been a gesture to Hamas. It would encourage Hamas to become even more violent and vicious. Obviously, our heart breaks for every lost Israeli and Palestinian innocent life. The blame rests entirely with Hamas and their state sponsors in Tehran, the Iranian government, which help orchestrate this attack. We have to defeat the terrorism in order to get to a peaceful two-state solution that will allow Israelis to continue to have a Jewish state and Palestinians to have an independent state of their own.
I shared that clip with you to set up some of the reaction to it. Now, admittedly, a lot of this may be colored more by people that dislike Pierre Poilievre than people who dislike Israel. But there was this one tweet from a critic of Poilievre's who says that when you reject this ceasefire premise, it's because you're not understanding world peace. So this idea that a ceasefire and peace are equivalent. And we have Joe Roberts back from JSpace Canada. Joe, I don't know how much of my previous question to you heard, but basically is a call for a ceasefire a dog whistle, to use that term, from people that are basically saying Israel does not have the right to fight back when it's attacked?
Look, I think there's a misconception about what a ceasefire is in this case, right? And what is the long-term goal? We've been in this situation in Gaza 6 times since the disengagement from Gaza back in 2005. What does that mean? That means we've had these conflicts every year, every other year. There's been this phrase used, mowing the lawn. It costs civilian lives. It costs Israeli lives. It costs lots of money and security. It's not a good situation. It's not sustainable. The status quo is not working. And so I think there's a realization across the board, both in Israel, the reality, they recognize that the citizenry demands a response, that this doesn't work, that this 1,400 deaths and this brutality is not acceptable, and they must act. And I think there's a realization that there is no path to peace without a fundamental change to the status quo, right? And so that means Hamas must be removed. It can no longer govern Gaza so that it can rebuild and do this again in a couple of years. So we'll be right back in the same place that we are today. And in the long run, we're going to have more death and more violence. So the goal here is a ceasefire is a pause. It's saying we're going to push a pause right now and come back to this violence over and over again, never break the cycle. And what I think what we're advocating for is to say, actually, this needs to be seen through. Hamas must be removed. The Palestinian people are not the enemy here. Hamas is the enemy. Remove Hamas, and then we can actually start a political solution to this conflict through a two-state solution, which is the only real way we'll ever end this cycle of violence.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I often believe that, well, not often, I think it's a pretty clear-cut fact at this point, that people who are very critical of Israel view Israel as being the impediment to a two-state solution, when, in fact, oftentimes it's the Palestinian activists who want a one-state solution, which is an entire Palestinian state.
Well, I mean, let's be clear about what a one-state solution means. It means the erasure of a Jewish state. It means the erasure of the Palestinian national aspiration, which they've worked very hard to legitimize over the last 75 years. They don't want it. Frankly, no one that would live under a one-state solution would want that, right? 71% of Palestinians reject one-state solution. 81% of Israelis reject a one-state solution. There's no path forward here without two states. There was a call yesterday between the Palestinian Authority ambassador to the European Union and some members of the EU, and someone said, well, what about a confederation, which is another word for a one-state reality? And he said, look, we reject this. Why would you? And I've never seen someone so angry, right? He said, we reject this. Why would you tell us that we don't deserve our own state? So the reality is it has to be a solution. Hamas is the impediment to that two states, right? That is, you cannot deal with a terrorist organization. Everyone knows this. You have to get rid of Hamas, and we'll move towards two states. It's the only long-term solution here.
The one thing I also find jarring about a lot of these calls for ceasefire is that they're not accompanied by a call to release hostages. Sometimes they are, but oftentimes they're not. They're just unqualified. Israel must stop its attack. Israel must stop its counteroffensive.
Again, I understand the impetus, right? I mentioned this in the piece. They're suffering. Human lives are being lost. There's no question about that. It's a horrible tragedy, no matter who they are. On either side, Israeli, Palestinian, it doesn't matter. And we have an obligation to make sure that this war is waged in a humane way. That means humanitarian aid continuously going into the West or to Gaza. That means we would advocate for the restoring of electricity and water to Gaza. We would advocate for fuel to be brought in for the hospitals, recognizing there are challenges with humanitarian aid, but still, we think it is a moral and humane thing to do, right? I think what the challenge here is when people don't see the humanity of both sides of this conflict, which it is easy to do when you are stuck in an echo chamber in the West, where you have no stakes in this, the people that are real lives on the ground don't matter to you. It's easy to say, I'm picking a team. This isn't a team sport. These are human beings. And the reality of this place is there are 7 million Israelis, there are 5 million Palestinians. Nobody's going anywhere. We have to share this place. We have to share this land, and we have to learn how to do that together.
Let me just ask you then, Joe, about a little bit of the way forward here, insofar as you and I are able to, put our heads together and solve this conflict in the next couple of minutes. But where is the way forward? Because right now, the Palestinian Authority is certainly a much better force than Hamas, but there is a legitimacy problem there that's often raised. And oftentimes I think it's raised by people who are more sympathetic to Hamas. But again, Abbas has, stayed there for far longer than he was elected. But the counterpoint to that is that if elections were held, it's very possible that Hamas would end up becoming more powerful. So how do you go forward when even the Palestinian cause, such as it is, isn't unified under one main voice and one main advocate?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a problem. And let's be clear, there has been no movement on peace building for the last 15 years. We've had extremists on both sides, extremist leadership in Israel. We've had extremist leadership in the West Bank with the Palestinian Authority who've said status quo is good for me. If it works for me, it works for everybody. Well, we've seen that doesn't work. It actually breaks down and causes horrible violence. So, there's a lot of consternation about the Palestinian Authority. And I agree. They have a legitimacy problem among their own people. Abbas is 88 years old. He's a chain smoker. He's not doing great. I don't think he's going to be the leader to move Palestinian people forward. And whenever reunification of Gaza comes, which it has to come, you can't have a two-state solution with a separate government in the West Bank from Gaza. It will have to be under a Palestinian Authority. Now, what does that mean? I mean, the Palestinian Authority has been undermined, defunded, challenged, I think limited in its abilities somewhat by the Israelis to make sure that they wouldn't become a threat. But I think we also look at the good things that the Palestinian Authority does. The Palestinian Authority has been committed to the two-state solution along the 1967 borders since 1987 when it was founded. The Palestinian Authority has rejected violence, right? You don't see violence being done in the name of the Palestinian Authority. You don't see a third intifada that's called by Abbas. They recognize a path forward is two states. They also recognize Hamas is a dangerous and violent extremist group that cannot be allowed to take root in the West Bank like they did in Gaza. And when remember, when Hamas took power in Gaza, they threw people off roofs. They executed 700 Palestinians to take power. All of them were affiliated with the Palestinian Authority and Fatah, the faction that controls the Palestinian Authority that Abbas is a part of. So I think there's a lot of alignment here. What we're going to have to do, and it's going to take U.S. leadership, Canadian partnership, and our allies are going to have to come together and have a plan. How do we actually strengthen the Palestinian Authority? How do we train them? How do we arm them so that they can defend themselves and also govern Gaza? It's not going to happen today. Even when Israel leaves, there's going to have to be some kind of transitional authority. But I think that the long-term solution, without the Palestinian Authority being in Gaza and a reunification, there's just no pathway to peace.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.